Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Isaac Tan, a history Ph.D. student at Columbia University, to talk about the discourse around blood in Japanese medicine in the early 20th century. Isaac, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me as well.
So, you also study this topic related to blood, which my listeners will know from an episode that we had a few weeks back. We had talked about this intersection between blood and science in post-war Korea. Can you talk a little bit about the historical context of your topic, the historical time frame, and just sort of generally what argument are you making around this idea of blood?
Okay, so my research topic is actually to bring a historical understanding of how blood type research was conducted in interwar Japan. So I'm actually looking at from 1910 to about 1945. Because in 1910 was the period when blood types were first discovered, and in 1916, Japanese scientists wrote the first article in Japanese on blood types, published in Japanese. So I'm looking at how blood type research was being conceived and how was it conducted during this interwar period in Japan. Because even today in the 21st century, Japanese will like to associate one's blood type with one's personality. So there's this historical background that I would like to trace and I'd like to uncover to see and to find out why and how is it even possible to make such a claim, because it's very similar to the Western idea of astrology, of horoscope, where you have a certain star sign, you have certain character traits. So in Japan, blood types is considered one of the ways to find out a person's personality and or temperament. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what were the motivations for looking into this topic? Of course, when people think about the study of blood and the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, ideas of eugenics tend to come up, and that sort of seems to be what defines the study in the West during this time. But were there other motivations? Was this one of the motivations? Were there other motivations? If you could talk about that.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because in Japan, the scientists were also interested in utilizing blood type knowledge to advance eugenics purposes as well, because there were actually quite a few articles in eugenics magazines that argue the importance of finding out one's blood type in order to find one's compatible marriage partners, in order to produce better offsprings in that sense. So but eugenics was actually just one small part of the entire discourse of blood types in Japan during the interwar period, because one major discourse at that time was that people were associating blood types with personality, as articulated by one local high school teacher who was actually just trained in psychology, but he wasn't a so-called specialist in the field. But he wrote this article saying that there are 4 blood types, and it could be categorized into the 4 temperaments that was already in the Western medical culture since the time of the Greek doctors Helen and Hippocrates. The humor theory. So he draw this link and say that there is this possibility of articulating one's blood type in terms of the different temperaments. So that's also one discourse of using blood types to advance this new idea of psychology, this new idea of seropsychology, I would say. And another concern was actually to debunk certain conceptions the Western scientists had at the time when they formulated their blood type discourses. Because, like, for example, one was that the majority of the Asian population had blood type B. So there was this link to say that there was, if you have a blood type B, you are more racially inferior. There was this idea of racial discrimination. So many of the Japanese blood scientists were actually trying to debunk that by conducting their own surveys to show that, look at Japan, the population here doesn't have a majority of a blood type B. So it was sort of like trying to show that, in terms of, biological differences, the Japanese were not much different from that of the Westerners, the Europeans. And so it was more of trying to show this sense of racial superiority as well, to create their own identity in that sense. So in many ways, blood type actually was being used by different people for different agendas. But as you have mentioned, eugenics was one concern as well, but there were also other concerns in Japan itself. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more in detail about some of the research that was done by these scientists linking blood with personality, national temperament, character, as you describe it in one part of the materials that you sent me? And if you're able to talk a little bit about the reception in the general public, how was this nationalist message, for example, how was that received, or how were other messages using blood as the baseline for conversation perceived?
Yep, great. I'll just keep it short because there's a whole lot of discourses out there on how this blood type discourse was actually being formulated. So to sum it up, the guy who came up with this idea of the 4 temperaments linked to the 4 blood types, he was actually initially trying to show that by looking at blood type, you could actually determine one's temperament. But later on, he realized that if you look at a macroscopic view, if you look at the proportion of certain blood types in a community, you could actually draw some links to the national temperament in a sense. So if you have a majority of blood type A in a community, you could say that that group of people being tested are much more active, much more enthusiastic in their national temperament. Whereas if you are if in a group there were more blood type B, the otherwise. So there was this idea of trying to show that, not just by looking at an individual's blood type, you could actually extrapolate out to examine the population to see how the distribution is like. So as for the reception, of course, many of the academics were actually initially quite doubtful of this whole argument, especially from the West. There were hardly any scientists who actually wrote about it. In fact, there were actually a few articles that were actually criticizing this whole idea of linking blood types with personality. But in the case of Japan, my argument would be that many of these scientists were seeing that this is actually a very new form of knowledge, whereby the Japanese could actually lead the community in conducting more research. And so, in fact, many of the doctors, military doctors, or even civilian doctors were actually conducting research to understand the links between blood types and personality. However, the thing was that despite all this research being done during the 1920s and 30s, nothing was conclusive. They were not able to find out any conclusive links between blood types and temperament. But instead, this whole drive of trying to conduct blood type surveys among the military population, among the civilian population, I would argue that it has actually kind of brought this knowledge of blood types to the common public, whereby many people will understand that, oh yeah, there's this need to actually get my blood type tested to see whether, am I compatible for this particular job, or who should I marry, and all these concerns. I would say that, in fact, during the 1940s, in the late 1940s, when Japan was coming to the end of the war, when air raids was actually being conducted against Tokyo and other parts of Japan, due to the need for blood transfusion, many people were asked to volunteer and go to blood donation drives to donate their blood. And in that process, they actually had their blood types being taken as well. So I would say the idea of blood type knowledge, this whole conception of blood types was actually very much also being pushed forward by the war, the needs of war at the time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thinking a little bit more about this idea of blood and identity, as this discourse developed between the 1910s and the 1940s, did this have any effect on gender dynamics or the way that some ethnic groups in Japan viewed other ethnic groups, like if it fostered any biases, and if so, what did that look like? If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yes, yeah, that's a very good question, because in this whole process of conducting blood type surveys, the Japanese scientists themselves are also trying to understand how to bring across this new knowledge and how to use this knowledge to create a new identity as well, especially among the different communities in the Japanese Empire. So, in fact, in trying to differentiate between the different communities to show that some communities were different from the rest, for one case, Japanese conducted surveys among the Japanese population to show that people from this particular region, whereby there were mythological folklores that say that the gods descended from them, and that's where the Japanese originated. And so they managed to show, they were trying to show that people from that particular group had a much more homogeneous distribution of blood types. So they were trying to trace that if there's a higher proportion of blood type A, it means that the Japanese were closer to the purer breed, the original breed of Japan, of the Japanese gods. So there was all these dubious ideas coming out, and not just within the Japanese population, they were also trying to justify, for example, in 1910s, when Korea was incorporated into the Japanese Empire, they were trying to also use the blood type distribution to say that, look at the distribution frequency of the blood types between the Japanese population and the Korean population. They were actually very similar. So in fact, we were actually from one ancestor. We could draw our biological ancestry back to one root. So it's trying to form this political agenda of saying that Japan and Korea should be considered as one unit. But there were also other cases whereby, for example, there was in the 1930s, there was a rebellion in Taiwan. The Simu were rebelling against, it was one of the major rebellions against Japanese rule. So the blood scientists actually did their survey as well of the indigenous tribes and realized that, then they showed that the blood type distribution of that particular indigenous group showed a much higher propensity of enthusiasm and taking a lot of initiative. So they were very much violent in a sense of trying to assert their opinions. So in a way, they were trying to use blood type distribution to explain that certain groups exhibit certain traits, certain groups behave in certain ways. So in trying to differentiate the Japanese from the rest, and even within the Japanese, the blood type discourses were being used in very much of in trying to prove that it's a scientific way, even though there wasn't much of an evidence or conclusive data to sustain that hypothesis. But nonetheless, because blood type discourses at that time was considered a very new and cutting-edge form of knowledge, so the Japanese scientists at the time were very much on board in trying to use this knowledge and to see that, and to try to prove in many ways to see whether it could be applied. But the thing was that inconclusive data was collected. They were not able to come up with they were not able to find definite links between blood types with personality, blood types with any other forms of human traits. So by the 1940s, all these discourses kind of fade off, and it became much of just for medical application for blood transfusion users, because the Japanese scientists themselves, I think they realized that all these research on trying to find out the non-medical aspects of blood types application doesn't seem to bear any substantial results in the end. Yeah.
Yeah, your the end of your comment leads into my next question, which is when I do a lot of these interviews, I'm often talking with other historians, and so I like to talk a little bit about, well, what happens beyond the time frame that you're talking about. And so I'm curious to know a little bit more about the legacy of the practice of medicine in Japan's relationship with the study of blood. Do any of these characteristics still linger in Japanese medicine today? And if you could also talk a little bit about, at the time that we're recording this, you are in Japan. How is this talked about in Japanese history textbooks, if at all? And how do Japanese people today retrospectively look back at this use of blood in medicine?
Okay, great. Yeah. So after the war in 1945, Japan had to slowly recover from the entire experience. And by the 1970s, and so the idea of blood type discourses wasn't very much being discussed. But in the 1970s, when Japan became one of the major economic powers in the 1970s, there was this idea of the Nihon Jinron. There was this idea of the Japanese uniqueness. Blood type again was used to show that there were certain traits that were seen in the Japanese population, as you can see from by surveying the blood type distribution in the Japanese population. So there was this revival again in the 1970s to use blood type distribution to reaffirm the uniqueness of a Japanese identity. This time around, it's not about the superiority, but rather it was a uniqueness idea of being Japanese, sorry. So it kind of lingers on even to today, because up to, a few years back, the idea of blood type would be one of the conversation starters among people going out on matchmaking events. Because I've heard from friends who ask that, one of the first few questions being asked would be like, what blood type are you? And the person will answer back, and then the response will be, oh, so you are, of certain traits. So people in Japan were still very much able to relate to how certain blood types is linked to certain traits, because in the 1970s, as I mentioned, there was this revival of blood types discourses again, and it was very much popularized by best-selling books written by certain journalists at the time, arguing how blood types actually could be associated with one's character. So it was kind of a linking back to the 1930s, but that link is not so much of a obvious one, or should I say, not many Japanese who actually know that in 1930s it was already out there, but rather people link it back to 1970s. So as for blood type discourses in popular Japan today, there were dramas, animes, or for example, if you just look at any Japanese dramas and those drama synopsis whereby they will tell you about this character of this character in this particular play, this character in this particular drama, who is he, or his perspective, his character, there will be one small section saying that what blood type he is of. So even till today, people are still kind of concerned what blood type is, but whether or not they believe it's the same kind of perspective that we would take with horoscopes, we would take with astrology. So if it's just that there's this up and down on how blood type is being accepted by the Japanese community even to today. So I would say that in popular Japan, right, in contemporary Japan today, people kind of know blood type discourses, kind of could relate to it, but whether they believe or not is another story altogether. Yeah.
Just to dive into contemporary politics just a little bit. Obviously there's, well, I shouldn't say obviously because not everyone knows, but for people who may have at least some knowledge of Japan, they may have noticed that there's been a rise in right-wing nationalism in Japan. And I wonder if this blood discourse happens to play into some of that, if you're aware just from your experience living in Japan and speaking with people who live there.
Yeah, good question. Because right now, my understanding and from my research is that blood type discourses is very much being articulated in the popular realm. It's not so much being linked to politics, the much, or as you mentioned, the right-wing nationalist emergence. So I would say that in all this right-wing nationalist discourses or this right-wing nationalist rhetoric, I have hardly heard of anything relating back to blood types, because my guess would be blood type discourses in Japan has become very much categorized into a kind of a popular culture, not so much of a serious matter of politics, serious matter of biology, of hard science that one should take it for as a matter of fact. But rather it's more like a cultural phenomenon, cultural manifestation, expression, I would say, that is not that much of a concern, or I would say not much of not much being able to convince people of to subscribe to a certain ideology or a certain brand of politics. So my understanding, I would say, is that I have not come across any of these writings of nationalist writings trying to relate it to blood type discourses, because my guess would be if the writings actually mention about blood type, it might discredit the entire discourse nationalist agenda in the first place, because right now people are very much associating blood types with popular culture, with anime, with Japanese pop. So it's not so much of a politics concern, I would say.
For anyone who's listening to this and they're interested in knowing a little bit more about this time period that you're studying, or knowing a little bit more about blood discourse in Japan, could you recommend one or two books that someone might find of use?
Oh, okay. I could think of a book by Miriam Silverberg, erotic grotesque nonsense or something like that. Yeah, it talks about the 1910s. Miriam Silverberg, erotic grotesque nonsense. So it talks about this whole culture of Japanese during the 1910s, 1920s to 30s. So that's one book I would recommend. Another I would probably suggest is Ruth Rogaski's Hygienic Modernity. Not so much of Japan itself, but it kind of explores how Japan exports this idea of hygiene, this idea of medical knowledge to places in China, especially or Japanese occupied China. And maybe one last book I would say would be Mizuno Hiromi's Science for the Empire. This whole new notion of scientific nationalism that came about during the 1930s and 40s. So maybe these three books would be a good introduction to the whole idea of mass culture in interwar Japan. Yeah.
Great, Isaac. Thank you for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me as well. Thank you.
And for those who are interested in exploring more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.